So you want to shoot action sports photography with your Fujifilm X-T3? Well, in this video, I'm going to go over my settings and approach for shooting action sports with the Fujifilm X-T3. And more importantly, I'm going to show you some behind the scenes footage as well as some example photos from a recent wakeboarding photography session. What's up guys, Reggie B Photo here and welcome back to the channel. For those of you who are new, my name is Reggie Balceros and I'm a wedding photographer based in the San Francisco Bay Area. So recently, a wedding client of mine invited me to take a ride on their family wakeboarding boat to tag along for some wakeboarding action, in lieu of the traditional engagement portrait session. Because I don't get to shoot this kind of stuff every day, I thought it would have been the perfect opportunity to show you guys my thought process and approach for shooting action sports with my Fujifilm X-T3. The X-T3 is hands down the fastest camera that Fujifilm currently has in its lineup. It's got 11 frames per second raw shooting with a mechanical shutter. It's got 100% phase detect autofocus across the entire sensor, and it's got the fastest autofocus system currently on Fujifilm's APS-C crop sensor cameras. Since I mostly use my X-T3 for shooting wedding, portraits, and photographing my kids, I wanted to see for myself how it would do for action sports. And before I continue, I'd like to mention that while I'm using the X-T3 specifically for this video, the truth is any modern DSLR or mirrorless camera is capable of shooting action sports to some degree. More than likely, you can find equivalent settings for your camera so that you can set it up very closely to how I set up mine. It's just your mileage will vary and your keeper rate will really depend on how fast the overall camera operation of your specific camera is. As always, what's really important is your overall technique and approach. Okay, now with that out of the way, I still want to talk about lens selection for a little bit. So as far as lenses go, I use the Fujifilm 90mm f2 for all these wakeboarding shots because of 3 reasons. 1, it's weather sealed because I'm going to be on a boat when I'm photographing this. And 2, it has the longest reach of all the lenses that I currently own. And 3, it also has the fastest autofocus of all the current lenses that I own. Obviously, any lens will do, but if you do have a choice, try choosing the lens with the faster autofocus. Also the one that will best fit the shooting conditions and the vantage point of your shoot. And as far as camera settings go, if you watch my other videos, you already know that I'm shooting in manual exposure with preview exposure on, the highlight warnings on, and the histogram on. Even for fast-paced action, I still prefer manual exposure because of its predictability and its exposure consistency across an entire shoot. Things change only when I decide to change them, not when the camera decides to. So my main priorities for setting the exposure for action photography is 1, to make sure that my shadows and highlights are not clipped, which is easy to do with the highlight warnings and the histogram, and 2, to make sure that I completely freeze the action. In order to do that, you want to choose a shutter speed that is fast enough. So typically that's 1/1000 of a second, but in this case for this shoot there was a lot of light, so getting a high shutter speed was not an issue at all. For the aperture, I like to shoot close to wide open just out of personal preference, but for this shoot I stopped down the lens just a little bit from f2.0 to 2.8 just to give the autofocus a little bit of wiggle room when trying to obtain focus throughout the action. And of course, I like to keep my ISOs as close to the base ISO as possible. A few of you have mentioned in the comments, why don't I just bring an ND filter to stay closer to the base ISO or to ISO 640, which is the highest dynamic range ISO setting. But the truth is, I don't bring an ND filter with me to still photography shoots. I only reserve ND filters for videography. So for action sports, even more important than my exposure settings are my autofocus settings. For this shoot, I was using AFC or autofocus continuous, specifically in the zone AF mode, and I was using a 3x3 square. These particular settings give me the ability to compose the shot that I want and choose where I want the subject to be, but still give me some wiggle room when trying to track the high-speed action. I have the AFC set to custom set to, which is to ignore obstacles and continue to track the subject. Obviously, being on a wakeboarding boat, I want to be able to track the subject, but also account for any type of water that splashes up or any bumps where I might point the camera in the wrong direction for a little bit. And the last setting I want to talk about is my drive mode. For this shoot, I set it to continuous high at 11 frames per second. So I'm a traditionalist and I use the mechanical shutter for all my professional work. So yes, while I have access to 20 frames per second with the electronic shutter or even 30 frames per second with the electronic shutter in the crop mode, for me, 11 frames per second burst is more than enough to capture some high-speed action for my style of photography. Alright, now that the gear and the setup is out of the way, I'm going to show you guys some behind-the-scenes footage and narrate my thought process and approach for getting these shots. So without further ado, let's jump into GoPro mode. So just a couple other boat logistics. I actually had my hold fast moneymaker strap on during this boat shoot just because I wanted to make sure that my X-T3 was securely locked onto my body. So right now I am tracking the wakeboarder. His name is DJ, and I'm basically keeping him inside that 3x3 box and following him along. You know, the X-T3 does have a limited buffer, so you don't want to be continuously rattling off the shutter throughout the whole time. I basically just starting off the shutter as he turns out and he approaches into the wake. That's when I start shooting right before he makes that jump. So for this first shot, you can see that the water is nice and crisp, the action is sharp, subject is sharp, and I actually composed DJ off to the left side because he's moving from the left to the right of the frame. For me, I personally like to give the subject some kind of negative space in the front to kind of convey that he's going from left to right. So again, the key here is to basically start the shutter right before the peak of the action and shoot through the moment until he lands again. And then you can go back into Lightroom afterwards to pick this peak action shot. At this point, I'm trying to accentuate how much air he's getting off of the wake. What we're trying to focus on is getting a high shutter speed. To freeze the action, I've got 2.8 for the aperture to make sure that there's a little bit of leeway for the autofocus to catch up. And basically, we're going here for the moment and the mood versus the compositional technique at this point. Again, I do have the negative space to the right of the subject just to make sure he's got the feeling of going somewhere. Good thing too is with any type of action sport, just to kind of familiarize yourself with what the athlete is actually doing. As you can see, DJ is always approaching out, and then once he approaches back in toward the wake is when I'm getting ready to shoot my burst. This one is just a simple shot of him approaching the wake again. As you can see, it's a very contrasty scene. I'm shooting at base ISO to make sure I can keep both the shadows and the highlights of the scene dialed in. And you know, the highlight warning really helps out here. So I really like this one. He's got a grab on the wakeboard going on here. And here you can see that there's actually splashes of water that are coming in the foreground right in front of my lens, but because I have that autofocus set to continuous custom setting set 2, it's gonna stay locked onto the subject no matter what type of obstacles go in front of the frame. And throughout this whole time, again, I'm just tracking him inside the box. You'll actually see me put my camera down for a little bit, just because I'm not going to be wasting high burst buffer on just nothing happening. But here DJ actually comes a little bit closer to the boat that I'm riding on. So here again, you can see everything is nice and crisp, and the 2.8 aperture is even keeping up, even though he's approaching the closer focusing range of the lens. Again, you can see those out of focus water droplets there. The autofocus is really doing a good job to stay locked in onto the subject's face here. So this one I actually misfocused just a little bit, but you know, on the screen here you can't really notice it. But I really like this one because you have a great expression here, and I'm always just trying to make sure as I'm composing, tracking these subjects, not to cut off any key parts. You know, I could crop at the handle, but I like having the wakeboard handle in there just to make sure that you have some context that he's wakeboarding. And I also try to keep these borders on the left and the right equal, as well as on the top of his head. Just a compositional technique that I do to always make sure that the subject is padded with the same amount of padding. And as you shoot more action sports, you'll get more practice at the timing of when you need to hold down the shutter. Really like this photo. I can't say it's an intentional composition, but this tree branch right here, I luckily caught him just kind of like framing the subject around here. And also this other tree on the right hand side does kind of like create this like little window for the subject to be doing his little trick. Again, throughout all these photos, I've always got negative space on the right, and of course everything is nice, crisp and sharp, just because I got those settings dialed in at 2.8 and a high shutter speed with the low ISO. And here is just approach going back to the wave where he extends his arm out. As you're doing these bursts, when you're calling the images for your gallery to do different parts of the action, it might get a little stale if you just use the same peak action and they're doing the same type of trick all the time. So try to vary it just for your clients to make sure they get a variety of looks. And then here he fell off, but it was a good run. We got some great photos in. I'm hoping you guys learned a little bit following this behind the scenes of how I actually shot these photos. So I'm hoping you learned something new about the Fujifilm X-T3 or just shooting action sports in general. If you want to see more behind the scenes / technique videos like this, hit that thumbs up button. And let me know down in the comments below if you have any special tips for shooting action sports photography. And if you're ready to pull the trigger on the Fujifilm X-T3 to be your action sports camera, I've got affiliate links in the description down below if you want to support the channel at no additional cost to you. Please be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, as I post a new Fujifilm or photography video just like these two every other week. And if you want to see more of my photo work, be sure to follow me on Instagram at ReggieBPhoto for a new post every single day. Alright, that's it for me. Remember to get out, go shoot, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.